resident archaeologist on the M28 Road project, which is of course a Cork County Council scheme in association with Transport Infrastructure Ireland. Late last year, Rubicon Heritage Services, together with TVAS Ireland, were awarded the contract to carry out the archaeological work on the project on what was a quality price basis following a tender process. The contract for the project, for the construction that is, isn't awarded yet. That's still a bit away. So at the moment it's just preliminary works ongoing. So there's fencing and clearance and some services being relocated. But alongside that as well, the archaeological project is ongoing. The aim of that being that it will be completed in plenty of time, so that it doesn't impact on the construction program once that gets going. Rubicon commenced their work in January of this year and are doing a great job so far, the details of which I will leave to the senior archaeologist on the project, Trish Long for Rubicon.
Hi everyone. As Ed was saying, I'm the senior archaeologist for Rubicon Heritage on the M28 scheme, and we just thought we'd use Heritage Week as a good opportunity to update people on what we've been doing on the scheme so far. I'm going to talk a bit as well about the archaeology that's in the lead up to the scheme, because there's quite a lot done before we ever kind of hit the ground, and just the whole process of how archaeology is identified and treated when we're on a road scheme like this. So the M28 road scheme comprises 12.5 kilometres of new road that will be built between Cork City and the tip of Ringaskiddy Peninsula. And as Ed said, the project has been progressed by Cork County Council on behalf of TII, Transport Infrastructure Ireland. And as with all new road schemes, the archaeological impact is carefully considered, and the archaeological fieldwork is done in advance of construction. And we've been on the ground here since January, and we're working in partnership with TVAS Ireland, who are another archaeological company. The scheme runs adjacent to the existing N28 for much of its route, and it passes through a number of townlands, including Moneygorney, Monkfieldstown, Mount Oval, Maryborough, Castle Treasure, Ballynimla, Ballinray, Shannon Park, Carrigaline Middle, Shanbally, Ballyhamaiken, Raffeen, Healy, Lochbeg and Ringaskiddy. So some of you might be from some of those townlands. The undulating land is well drained and fertile, and that, combined with its location on the edge of Cork Harbour, makes it a very attractive location to human settlement, and that's been the case all through the ages. The land is mainly farmland, and there's industrialised areas on the northern and eastern ends. And there's several locations along the scheme, such as Ballinray West and Healy, where you've got a pretty spectacular view over the peninsula and Cork Harbour. And when the route was being selected for the road, archaeology was included in the environmental impact statement. And since then, there have been a big range of desk-based studies carried out to determine how the scheme might impact archaeological remains. And this means that before we ever turn a sod on the project, we have a pretty good idea of the archaeology in the area. Prior to the scheme, we had very little evidence of prehistoric activity on the Ringaskiddy Peninsula, but we know that the area, because of its characteristics, would have been exploited since the first settlers in the Mesolithic period, in the hunter-gatherers who used stone tools. And there's numerous shell middens known along the coast of Ringaskiddy, and that can be seen in situ. They haven't been dated, but a lot of them could be Mesolithic in date because they were a common monument from the period. By about 4000 BC, the earlier hunter-gatherer economy of the Mesolithic period was replaced by one dominated by farming, and we call this the Neolithic period. And this led to more permanent communities and settlements, but there was no known sites of this date in the area prior to the scheme. There has been 2 stone axe heads found in Carrigaline, which tell us that they were actually in the area. There was a little more evidence of the Bronze Age, again through a number of stray finds such as beads and axe heads and spearheads. One of the most notable of these Bronze Age finds is this gold disc from the townland of Castle Treasure, and that's been in the British Museum since the 1800s, and it was actually apparently part of a Bronze Age hoard that was found up there at the time. The rest of it has been lost. And there are some monuments from the period in the landscape. There was 2 standing stones at Ballyhamaiken, but they're no longer present. I think they were up there until the 1980s, but they're no longer in the landscape. And there's also a number of Fullochfia, and these are the most common prehistoric monument that we get, and they mostly date to the Bronze Age. It seems the sites were used for a variety of purposes. That was required the boiling of water. So they boiled the water in pits dug into the ground using hot stones from a nearby fire, and that would have boiled the water for uses in cooking, bathing, tanning and other possible uses. There's very little from the Iron Age in the area, but there is a fair bit from the early medieval period, and that's well represented. The road development falls within the ancient territory of the Carriga-Kirka, which gives its name to the modern barony of Kerry-Currahee. And there are a number of ring forts which were enclosed farmsteads dating that period in the area, such as the one in Barney Healy, which is the one in the aerial photograph here. There's a few in Carrigaline, Ballinray and Shanbally. The evidence from the late medieval period then is concentrated around Barney Healy Castle, Tower House and Bawn, and that's located on the southern end of the scheme. And the land of Barney Healy was in the possession of the de Cogans since sometime before 1279, and the first mention of the castle at Barney Healy occurs in the 16th century when Richard de Cogan was lord of the manor in 1536, and architecturally the present ruins tie in with that. There's a late medieval church and graveyard. It's actually within the site of the current modern day Barney Healy graveyard. So this view here, you can see Barney Healy graveyard at the bottom, and you can see Barney Healy Castle at the top, and the road actually runs in between. The new road will run in between the two of those. The de Cogans surrendered the castle to Lord Inchiquin in 1642, and it was later granted to the Cromwellian judge John Cook, but he was hung, drawn and quartered at some stage, and then the lands were split up after that. And it came into the hands of the Warrens in 1796, and they constructed an 18th century house on the foundations of the earlier castle, and that became known as Castle Warren. So that's actually what you see standing on the site today. During the post-medieval period then, a system of estate landholding was imposed, and we have lots of classical domains around the place. Maryborough, Mount Oval, Bloomfield and Castle Warren itself would have been one. And then the tenant farmers would have occupied vernacular houses in the area. The Martello Tower is one of 5 that was built in the early 1800s. That's the one in Ringaskiddy. And excuse me. And that was because of the resumption of war between Britain and France at the time, and it was inhabited until the 1940s. So that's basically what we knew of the archaeology of the area before we started targeting the route of the road. And once all the information is gathered about the known archaeology, we begin to hunt for clues for any hidden archaeology that might be under the ground that might be impacted by the road scheme. And I'm just going to briefly outline a few of the non-invasive techniques that would have been used very early on in the process. One of these would have been the historic mapping, and that would have been examined for any evidence of structures or activity that would be on the site, on the maps, but that might have since disappeared from the landscape. We also look at aerial photographs and satellite images, as we can often see things that we can't see at ground level. It's not very clear here, but you can see the black shadow in this aerial photograph. It told us that the remains of a Fulloch Fia extended out into that field, which is actually within the road take. LiDAR survey is another pretty modern. It can be taken for a variety of reasons, but the LiDAR data that we had in the whole area was also examined for signs of ground disturbance in the past. Geophysical survey then is one of the key tools that we use. They use a special machinery to scan over the ground and produce grayscale images like this one, and this kind of helps us try to see what might be under the ground surface. So I think you can see the linear and circular patterns here that don't occur naturally. So when we see something like that, we immediately think this is likely an archaeological site. And it was actually the results of this geophysical survey that first highlighted we had a significant enclosure complex at Barney Healy, and I'll talk a bit more about that later. But just to remember these circular patterns on this scan, that was how we first identified these enclosures. So the last step then in the process of identifying the location of archaeology on the route is actually test trenching. And this is also the first stage of archaeological fieldwork. And on the M28 commenced in January of this year. So it was awarded to Rubicon Heritage, and as I was saying, I was the senior archaeologist in the project, and my job is to oversee a team of around 50 staff that we have carrying out this work. And we in turn then are working under the supervision of Ed, who spoke here earlier, the Cork County Council resident archaeologist, and Ken Hanley, who's the Transport Infrastructure Ireland project archaeologist. So this process involves excavation of linear trenches by a tracked excavator under constant archaeological supervision, and this is done under very strict conditions which are related to the licences issued by the National Monument Service to carry out the work. and that is in turn related to a ministerial direction for the archaeological work on the scheme. In our main phase of testing between January and March, we carried out over 50,000 linear metres of this trenching, and that was to meet a 12% coverage of the scheme, and that's the kind of legal requirement in this country. So, of course, then we encountered a full spectrum of the weather of the Irish winter and spring had to offer. And there's just a couple of images here of our archaeologists at work in different conditions. But it didn't manage to put a stop to our intrepid archaeologists anyway, because we identified a total of 131 areas of potential archaeology across the length of the scheme. This next slide here hopefully will work for me. This is actually a time-lapse video of test trenching underway, so this is speeded up. But you can just see how it's carried out there. The machine removes the topsoil, and we only go to that depth because we reach the old ground surface then, and we can see if there's any remains of archaeology in there, and it's constantly watched by an archaeologist. If they notice anything that they think is archaeological, they record it at that time. We backfill all those trenches, and then we come back for a later stage of work after that. In parallel with the test trenching, we recorded all the townland boundaries along the length of the route that will be impacted by the scheme, and this is just an image of a section through a townland boundary there, and we make all the records of the piece that's going to be removed. And we also undertook a number of built heritage surveys on some of the upstanding remains that are going to be removed when the road is going to be built. That includes the gatehouse of Prospect Villa, which is down in Barney Healy. Just the remains of that there was almost totally overgrown, so it's just kind of been exposed, and we carried out these scans. And we also had the remains of a pedestrian footbridge over a railway cutting in Ballyhamaiken. So as I mentioned, where we do find signs of potential archaeology, our next stage of work is to come back and remove the topsoil from a kind of a larger area, boxed area around any signs of archaeology. And that's just so we can better establish the nature and extent of any remains. The topsoil is removed again under constant archaeological supervision. And we've stripped about 102,000 square metres of topsoil across the 131 defined areas between May and August. So I think we're going to be finished it on Monday, this stage of work, the stripping on the ground. And once the topsoil then is removed, a team of archaeologists comes in and they clean back the ground using hose and trowels and all the kind of usual things you'd expect an archaeologist to be using. And they map the shapes and the soil differences that tell us that there's archaeology present. And that's just after changing on its own. We use GPS survey equipment to map the locations of everything, and then once we confirm there is archaeology present, we prepare the ground then for full scale hand excavation, which is our third stage of fieldwork. So as I was saying, we've just come into the end of this second phase, so we're relatively early in the process overall, so we don't actually dig into the archaeology at this stage, but we do get a good impression of what we might have, and already we can see that we're going to have a massive amount of information on the human settlement in the area that we're going to be able to add to what we know about the past in Ringaskiddy. I'm just going to run through a few of the highlights that we have so far. We've identified a Mesolithic flint artefact at Barney Healy, and that just confirms for us for the first time that we did have human occupation on the peninsula by hunter-gatherers over 6,000 years ago. Another very early site that we have, and this is a very exciting one for us, as I said at the start, we didn't have any known Neolithic sites on the peninsula before the road scheme, and we think we might have one here. So at Ballyhamaiken 3A, and that's located on the western slopes of Raffeen Quarry, we've identified the rectangular foundation of a typical early Neolithic house. And we also found sherds of carinated bowl, which is the first type of pottery to come into Ireland. It came with the first farmers. So I don't know if you can see, there's a rectangular outline here in the soil. So that's what we see on the ground at the moment, and that tells us that there's archaeology present. What we have over here is not from the scheme, but I just put them up there to give you an example of their reconstruction drawings that we've done of previous Neolithic houses that we've excavated around the country, to show you that what we're getting is the foundation trenches for post holes and beams that would have held an upright house. And that's just some pictures of carinated pottery. So what we have at the moment are just a few small sherds, but hopefully we'll get a lot more of it as we do further excavation. I think this is another. Yeah, this is just an overview of the archaeologists out. when I think if you can kind of see the rectangular structure in the centre, so you can see we have quite a big site and there's lots of other bits of archaeology around it, and this is just the archaeologist cleaning it all back and recording it. So that's the stage of work that's ongoing at the moment. At Lochbeg Tree then, that's down the southern end and it's on the slopes overlooking the deep water port at the eastern end of the scheme, sorry. And we found a cluster of cremation burials there, and we have a sherd of an early Bronze Age vase urn, and this is, we also have a sherd of a food vessel, so this has been identified by specialists as early Bronze Age in date, and we have some associated cremated bone visible in the ground as well at that stage. So we'll be going on to do further stages of work there. What we'll often do if we find any sign of pottery, we'll bring out a specialist conservator to block lift the remains and excavate them in a lab. We have a few other sites where we have with what we think are Bronze Age cremations as well, including at Ballymahike and Raffeen. We have another site which might be a funerary monument of the Bronze Age as well, and this is at Shanbally, just to the back of the village there near the soccer pitch. And this is what we call a ring ditch, so I don't know if you can see the circular ring pattern in the soil there. And these can be kind of any date from Bronze Age up to the Iron Age, and they're usually associated with burial or cremated human remains. So we haven't seen any sign of a burial on this, but what we're getting is only that just what survives after ploughing and everything over the years. On the other picture here is just a reconstruction drawing again, of just to give you an idea of what these things might have been used for in the past. They would have just dug out the soil to make a bank around, and then they would have probably had ceremonial events in there. We'd often find cremations placed within the ring ditch itself, or there would have been mounds covering them, and there might have been a mound here in the past that has since been destroyed. We have the remains of a number of Fulloch Fia on the scheme, and there's at least 3 large burnt mounds identified, and this is just a picture of one at Barney Healy. So what you can see here is just the black burnt stone remains, and that's the stuff that they used. Once the stones had finished heating the water, they scooped out all the stones and threw them to one side, and they would have used these over very long periods of time, creating these big black mounds. And you'll often hear a farmer saying, "Oh, over the years I was ploughing there and I could see this black patch," and that's often what you have underneath it. So once we take off the mound there at a later stage, we hope to find the troughs, and sometimes you find wooden trough remains and things like that if they're well preserved. We have a number of Bronze Age settlement sites identified as well. This one is at Raffeen on the other side of the quarry from the Neolithic house. The quarry was on a limestone, well-drained area, and they're very common prehistoric locations. They like to be in those kind of locations. It's very hard to see in the slide here. The aerial photograph from very high up, you can just kind of see a couple of circular patterns in that area, and we found some Bronze Age pottery. And then just in the field next door as well, you can see the archaeologist putting little tags in here where he's finding stake and post holes where there would have been a house structure. So the main reason we know it's Bronze Age is because we found several bits of pottery spread throughout the site, and that's just from cleaning off the top. And a specialist has identified them as Middle and Late Bronze Age in date. Very recently, only last week, really, we've identified a large enclosure up in Ballinray, which is up in the hill and has a great view of the surrounding countryside. Again, we have an aerial photograph there, and you can kind of see it's like a D-shaped pattern in it, and that's we actually have nothing datable out of that, but just the form and shape of it and its location would make us think it might be early medieval. So we have a good bit to find out about that yet. And then we're moving up again later in date, up in Ballinimla, which is at the northern end of the scheme. We have what we think is a 17th century farmstead. So this photo is it's hard to make it out, but we have a number of rectangular enclosures in this one, and we think what we might have is a rectangular farmstead with a number of field systems coming off it. We're finding lots of 17th century pottery within the site, and what makes this one very interesting is one of the archaeologists on site, Dylan, when he was doing a bit of research, he came across some historical records of a court case back in 1642 where William Green of Ballinimla had been ransacked, and it goes into great detail about his cattle and everything that was stolen from him. Ballinimla is actually a tiny townland, so we're quite excited about that because we think it might actually be referring to what we've actually found in the ground here. So we're looking forward to doing a lot more research on that. That brings me to our what we like to think of as our showstopper site down at Barney Healy. So this was an area on the scheme where we were aware there was archaeology there for some time. So I mentioned earlier we had the castle and the graveyard and the road was running between it. So there was quite a lot of investigation done there at a very early stage just to make sure that people knew what they were dealing with. And it was prioritised then by Cork County Council. So while we were doing all that other stages of work on the rest of the scheme, we kind of went straight into excavation here just so we'd have plenty of time to deal with it within our programme. This is just an overview that was taken in, I think, 2004, and it just kind of shows, you can see the castle and the graveyard, and you can kind of show a few areas there that were highlighted for further study at that time. And then I showed this clip earlier. This is the geophysical survey results. The road widens out here. I think it's an attenuation pond or something that's going in here, but once they saw, they were trying to investigate the area because of its high potential. They did this geophys, saw these circular shapes, and then they went on to do a little bit of testing and were able to confirm that we have an enclosure complex here, and it's probably of early medieval date, so it would predate the castle. The location where it is, it's hard to visualise it nowadays when you're down there and the area has changed so much and the port has been reclaimed, but it would have been in a very narrow point in the peninsula, which would have been kind of controlling the whole peninsula, and the water was coming up fairly close on either side. It's a very strategic location, which might explain why we have such a lot of activity there from the early medieval period, and then when the Normans came, they continued to wanting to control that point in the landscape. When we stripped off the topsoil then, this is our first, this is the first attempt we made at mapping and the archaeology that we could see. We've done all this with the GPS survey equipment that I was saying earlier on, and it produced these kind of line drawings. So this shows you a bit more clearly the circular shapes. There's a kind of more rectangular stuff up at that side, and it just shows you that there's a lot of information there in the ground that we need to investigate. And this photo then is pretty recent, and it gives you an idea of the size of the site where we've stripped off the topsoil. We've mounded the topsoil to one side, and I think we've stripped about 18,000 square metres of topsoil in this area up to this point. It's not actually very clear because of the ground conditions there, but hopefully you can see some of the circular patterns in these aerial photographs as well. So we had our geophysical survey. When we stripped off the topsoil, we saw these patterns that were exactly where the geophysical survey was, and then we started putting in our bits of test trenching, and we were able to confirm that they were enclosures. So we did a few extra bits of testing down there as well in more recent times, just adjacent to the castle where there's a foul sewer diversion going in. Now we have found a few things in this area, but the area is very disturbed in the post-medieval period. It looks like they've been reclaiming the ground and things there. So we found a few pits and things that might be associated with the occupation of the castle, but we haven't found anything dramatic related to that. So we're finally at the stage where we're able to start digging after all our establishing where everything is. And this is just a couple of images of the archaeologists on site in the very hot conditions in the last while. They've been digging out the ditches. So what we dig out is the material creating those dark patterns in the ground. We dig that out because that's what's filled up the shapes that have been dug out in the past. So we excavate all that out, and that's kind of where we find our material. And what we're left with then is just the impressions in the ground. So this is just another little video clip of just day-to-day archaeology work going on. So you have the people digging, but then also you see the people there with the paperwork. And the paperwork is a really important element because we record everything in great detail. We number everything, and that's how we analyse what's in the ground, and it's also going to be there then for future study. So once the site is gone, it's gone, but at least then there's a good record of it preserved. We take lots of samples, soil samples, bone samples, and that's just images there of the buckets being taken out of the ground, and we take those back to we have an office in Middleton. We process them, they're put through water tanks and sieves, and we look for any material that might be in it. We also carry out lots of drawings and photographs, which records everything in its original location. I think this is just a little video of some of the lads on site sieving the material that we take out of the ground. So that's just in case we're missing any artefacts or anything like that. When they dig it out by hand, it goes into barrows and then it's sieved again after that. So now we're about halfway through the excavation down there. We expect it to go on until the end of October, early November, and that's kind of a more recent photo of the site, and you can see these shapes, what the staff have dug out there over the last few months. And it's actually, they're really big ditches. It's very hard physical labour in the heat down there at the moment, but some of the ditches there are nearly 3 metres wide, and the base of them have cut into the bedrock that was originally on the site. So they would have been fairly defensive structures that would have been very hard to get across in the past. Yeah, so this is just the overview map again, just to show you. We found a bit of prehistoric archaeology here, just on the east side of the site. So here, here, and here. So this is the earliest archaeology we found in the site. Just up in the northeast corner here, we have this cluster of pits, which we know to be prehistoric grain storage pits. So they're just big circular pits that they would have dug in the ground, and that's where they would have stored their grain over the winter. We found carbonised grain in the samples. We haven't even analysed the samples yet, but there was so much grain in them that we could see the carbonised grain. And then if you could see all these stone fragments that the staff were digging out there, they were saddle querns, which were the prehistoric method of grinding grain to create flour. So we found bits of saddle querns in nearly all the pits, and we think they're very deliberately, at the end of the site, when the work was finished, they would have broken up the querns and distributed them into the pits and post holes in the area. We also got this tiny blue glass bead, which is common enough in the Bronze Age. It's the earliest form of glass artefacts in the country. And here we have a very happy looking bunch of archaeologists who are quite delighted when they find these saddle querns. So this is just a little image at the bottom of how these querns might have been used in the past. So they would have had a rubbing stone on top of a base, and then that's just a collection of some of the stuff that we recovered there. This is also another element of the site that we think might be prehistoric. So I mentioned ring ditches earlier. So we seem to have a ring ditch here with some concentric outer ditches. We actually didn't find any artefacts at all in this part of the site, so we're not sure about the dating, but just outside it we found some Middle Bronze Age pottery. So we're thinking it might be Bronze Age, and it might be around the same time as those grain pits were being used. We'll analyse the samples and hopefully we'll get it. This is just it's actually raining in this little video clip, but it's just kind of showing the ring ditch in a kind of a not so dusty a day. So now we're up to the first of the enclosures that we've excavated on the east of the site. You can see here there's a series of ditches, and what they have here is they've been replacing the enclosures over time. So when one went out of commission, they might have created a new one. They dug the big ditches. There would have been banks there at the time, and we have some that seem to be going outside the road take. And what we found in this area was lots of slag, which is the waste product from metalworking, ironworking, and I think even copper working. And there's such a huge quantity there that we think it's going to be a pretty significant metalworking site in the medieval period. We've only got one radiocarbon date so far, and this is just a kind of a preliminary thing. We'll be getting a lot more of them, which builds a more detailed picture. But we sent away a fragment of bone from the base of one of the ditches, and we got this date of 775 to 884. So that's just an indication of the kind of time period that we're dealing with here. And then what we get is the remains of, they just appear as like pits in the ground, and they're kind of burnt red from the heat. And they're just the remnants of this kind of metalworking activity where they would have built little furnaces and they would have been working away there. So this could be a little industrial site from that date. We're currently in the middle of digging the main enclosure that we have, a circular enclosure, a very wide ditch, and that's what kind of the staff have been doing the last few weeks, is just digging away in there. There's a lot of digging. We're getting a good bit of animal bone, especially from the base of the ditch, so that probably would have been discarded from eating and feasting and things at the time. Very few artefacts, which isn't uncommon. We have a few metal things that we can't even tell what they are yet. They'll be x-rayed and conserved and things. We have this one unusual find is a blue glass toggle, and it's actually quite a bit older than the ditch itself. It would have been more like Iron Age in date, 1st century BC to 1st century AD. So that's in the ditch, but it's either that the ditch cut through earlier activity there, or maybe somebody had retained this artefact and it was deposited in the ditch at some stage. So we have quite a lot to do within this enclosure yet, and we're only kind of getting into the middle of it. There's another enclosure in the south of the site, Area C, We haven't even started in that really. When we did our stage 2 work, we saw some kilns and things in the interior, so again we think it might be more of an industrial area rather than a settlement area. So that's the enclosure stuff. Within the same area then, between those enclosures and the castle, we came across this. There's on the first edition Ordnance Survey maps that were taken in the mid-19th century, there's a boundary on the mapping, and we're carrying out an excavation on this area, and we found this wall within a boundary, which is kind of unusual, and the wall as well was faced with mortar. So one of the interpretations we have for it is that it may have been a ha-ha ditch related to Castle Warren, the Castle Warren estate. And a ha-ha ditch was a kind of a landscaping feature where they didn't want a big ugly wall spoiling the view out the window of the castle. So they dug a ditch to put the wall in, and that would have kept animals either in or out, depending on where they wanted to keep them. So when you looked over your landscape, you wouldn't have even seen this from the castle. So that's the kind of aim they were going for that time, trying to keep the landscape natural looking. There's just a few more views of it there under excavation, an aerial view of it there. So it seems to be running for quite a distance along there. This is up closer to the castle itself. Then we have a ditch that we call a ditch cut into the ground surface, and here he is excavating it out, and you can kind of see the layers of shell in there. So that's and that's just a close-up of the kind of shell we're getting, and we call that shell midden material, and that's just the waste products from people eating shellfish basically. So we have a huge variety of shellfish there. There's winkles and mussels and clams and oysters, and then there's different layers as well. And we've taken specific samples there that will be able to tell us, we'll date them, and we'll be able to look at the seasonality as well of what they're eating in different seasons. We're not sure about the date of this material yet. We think it might be fairly late, so it might be early post-medieval or that way, but we're not actually sure. And there's a lot of shellfish in a lot of features around the site, which you think wouldn't be unusual because we're obviously on the coast, but the Irish just weren't actually big shellfish eaters or fish eaters in medieval and post-medieval times. We had a specialist out to look at them, and the only thing she could conclude was that they were pre-famine because of the size of the shells, because during the famine they over-exploited the shells, and then after the famine you get very small shells that they were using. So she thinks that this is probably pre-famine in date. So that's kind of where we are at the moment. Just a quick few acknowledgements to the archaeological crew on the scheme. As I said, we've about 50 people out there working very hard. We also have a great team in Cork County Council overseeing the works, the senior, the project, the resident engineers. We have Ed Lyne, who's the resident archaeologist with the council, and Ken Hanley. I'd also like to thank Jonathan Miller, who's here with me tonight. He's with Rubicon Heritage, and he did a lot of help putting this together. There's further information. We've launched what we call a story map, so there's an online link there, and a lot of the information I've been talking about here tonight is up on this story map. So it's a kind of an online thing that you can go on and scroll through, and it has the images and the information and the mapping, and it kind of puts it all together. And it was Jonathan working on that during the week. We also, for Heritage Week, we have put together, it's more for children, it's an archaeology themed puzzle pack. I think Johnson has a few of them there tonight that he can give out to anyone who wants it. And all of this is on any of, if you Google Rubicon and our social media streams, you'll find any of this information. And we've also put together this mini photograph exhibition. So from the start of the scheme, we've just run a little photo competition for the staff every month. And there's just some great images coming from site on the work that we're doing, and just how beautiful the general area is around here as well. So we hope to add to that over time. And as I say, we're kind of in the early stages of this work, so we're hoping to have a few more talks and exhibitions and different events just to kind of let people know what we're getting. And then of course all these road schemes, the end product of them will be a monograph publication, a book. That's probably a few years down the line because we'll have all our off-site lab works and everything to do and reporting to do before that. But eventually that will be out there with all the information for anyone who wants it as well. So thank you all very much for coming tonight, and I hope you got a bit of information out of it anyway. And if anyone has any questions, I'm happy to answer them as well. No.